My guest today in the YouTube universe is Scott Murkin. He's a doctor, MD. He is a hospice physician from North Carolina. He designs original quilts for the bed and for the wall. Scott exhibits nationally and internationally, and his textile artworks are in prestigious public and private collections. And his quilts have appeared in numerous publications. Scott is an NACQJ certified judge who has worked in the judging rooms at the most prestigious quilting events throughout the USA, including AQS, NQA, and QuiltCon, just to name a few. Today, we're going to talk about what do quilt judges look for in an award-winning quilt. Scott, welcome to the Quilter on Fire YouTube channel.
Thank you, Brandy. I'm excited to have an opportunity to share with your audience today.
So this is a space for learning. Everyone is welcome here. I encourage everyone who's watching right now to put their questions in the comments because I always reply. Now, I'm so excited to explore this topic with Scott. It is such an important topic in the quilting world. Judging can be very scary for some people. So, Scott, what do you say to quilters who would never consider entering a quilt in a judged show? Let's start there.
Typically, in those cases, you're talking to people at a local guild level, and most of our local guilds have something in their charter that is their mission statement that says that their goal as an organization is to share the love of quilting with their community. And so by entering your quilts, you're actually serving the mission of your organization. So it really isn't always about you personally. I do
Mhm.
believe, and I have no way to prove this, but I believe that every quilt that gets entered in a show will be someone's favorite quilt at that show. You won't know it probably, but you will spark something in someone by entering your quilt. So really, you're not doing it just for yourself, you're doing it for your community.
Oh, that is such a good message because imagine a child walking through a show or a newer quilter walking through a show or someone who would never consider entering a show and they see your quilt and they realize, oh, this is just like what I do, or I can do that, or maybe I should enter this show. That is such a great way to start this conversation. Okay, so I want to go right into kind of an overview of what a judge does. So let's start off with what does it mean for a judge to have an order of judging in their head?
So an order of judging helps you to be consistent and it helps you to not miss anything. And I don't think it's unique to me, but my order of judging is roughly the order that a quilt gets made in.
Mhm.
So you're going to look at the overall appearance, you're going to look at the design, you're going to look at the top construction, you're going to look at the quilting design, then the quilting technique, then the finishing. That's the order that a quilt gets made in. And if I stick to that with every quilt, then I don't have to wonder halfway through the day, oh my gosh, was I fair? Did I give each quilt its true advantage?
Yeah.
After a while, that becomes so ingrained in your head, you don't actually have to verbalize it or even think it in your head. You just know that that's the order you go in.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense because if there's 20 quilts in one category and you're using the same order of judging on every quilt, then you're fairly judging them against each other, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into those in a little bit more detail. So let's start off with overall visual impact. What does the judge look for there?
So you're looking for interest, you're looking for cohesiveness, completeness. I think it's a common misconception that overall visual impact means like it has to be bright jewel tones, like really like almost stab you in the eye. Whereas it's really a wow factor. It's the quilt that makes you stop just a little bit longer and look at it, and that can be because of how subtle it is. It doesn't have to be bold to have a strong visual impact, but it does have to be cohesive. All the parts have to work together, and of course, it can't have things like pet hairs all over it and things like that. So it's a crisp, clean, finished design that is all together.
Yeah, that sounds good. So moving into the design aspect of quilting, what are you looking for there?
So really, design in all media is a balance between unity and diversity or variety. And so you're trying to find that sweet spot between I want to have as much variety in my design as possible while it all still looks like it goes together. Now there's a huge spectrum still in there that's acceptable. So some quilts are inherently simple in their design, but maybe have something interesting in their coloration or in their finishing. Um, but you're looking at all of those terms of design, the rhythm, the balance, the proportions, the scale, the unity, all of those things. Very often I'm looking for visual pathways that lead my eye through the quilt, um, things that are unexpected that make me feel like I got a little glimpse of the quilt maker. I can't, know how accurate that is, but at least the feeling that a person who made this is sort of shining through the design.
Yeah, an example comes to mind at a show I judged recently where it was a hexagon quilt. So it was English paper pieced, thousands of hexagons. It was very scrappy. But one thing they did, which, when you mentioned drawing your eye around the quilt, one thing they did really well was they had borders on this quilt, a couple of borders in various sizes, but one of the borders had black and white in one of the inner borders. And throughout the entire scrap quilt, they splashed in black and white fabrics, and it just drew your eye around the quilt and made it very cohesive. So that's an example that comes to mind. Let's just talk a little bit more about design in some of the problems that you see most often. So what pops into your head of things that you see in the design aspect of the quilt that happen over and over again?
So one thing that happens is you see a quilt and you get a sense that the maker took 7 workshops this past year and they decided they were going to use everything they learned in every one of them. And
Yeah.
it's not that you can't do that. It's possible to get away with that, but it has to be done very thoughtfully and not just because you know how to do it. So that's one area, is that lack of cohesion.
Mhm.
That there's some neat things, but when you pull back and look at them all together, they don't play well together. And a very common example of that is you have a beautiful body of a quilt, and then you have a border on it that doesn't visually relate, or the scale or proportion is wrong. It's real obvious if someone goes, "Oh, I need my quilt to be 40 inches wider," and sticks a 20-inch border all around it.
Yeah.
That's almost never going to be the correct scale or proportion if you're doing it just to make it a certain size to fit your bed. So that has to be part of the design process all the way back at the beginning, that you're figuring that out. And there's no perfect formula. There's no way to calculate and say a border has to be X percentage of the body of the quilt, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint. But people want to know, well, what's the right one? Well, show me the quilt. I need to see.
Yeah.
Some quilts can get away with a little thin border, and others are just can't be contained by that. So it's a visual assessment, not a mathematical calculation.
Let's talk a bit about quilting designs because sometimes they can have no relation to the piecing, right?
Yeah, and I am not against pantographs, but there's a lot of them out there.
Mhm.
So pick one that thematically relates to your quilt if that's the way you're going. And it absolutely can look gorgeous that way. Of course, custom quilting is going to take most quilts to the next level, and it's going to give them an edge. The most important thing is that, again, we talked about scale and proportion. The motifs need to be in scale to the space they're filling. So you don't want a motif that's crowded all up against the edges of the block or even spilling over it into the next space. But you also don't want a tiny little design floating in the middle of a big 20-inch block with nothing around it. So again, that pleasing in between stage where the space is completely filled without being crowded.
Yeah, and something I think worth mentioning here is that if you're a quilter, it doesn't matter if you've pieced it and someone else has quilted it. It doesn't matter if you're doing the entire thing yourself. It doesn't matter if it's a collaboration, but it's a really good idea if you're going to take your pieced quilt to a long arm quilter that you decide what the design's going to be. It's your quilt, right? So you can have an input. It might be, you might want to just say, go ahead and do whatever you like. And it might come back and you might be thinking, oh, that's not really what I was hoping for, right? So why not be a
Right.
part of that decision as well?
Right, you don't have to draw the whole design and where it'll go, but you can at least communicate what your vision is with this and how you want it to go. And if the person is of high quality, they're going to respect that and actually appreciate having some guidance so that you're not mad at them and they can keep getting repeat business.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about workmanship and techniques. So this can be the type of feedback from a judge that can really help a quilter step up their game. So what are you looking for there?
So the biggest word across all workmanship and techniques is consistency. So if you do something consistently, then it's going to appear to the judge that it was intentional.
Mhm.
So if the the density of the stitching is consistent and the stitch length is consistent and the spacing between stitches, all those things come back to consistency. Now there are then within those there's in piecing. A really common problem I see, and I don't know if it's because the stitch length is too long or because they're too heavy-handed with their iron, but when you can see a thread, the piecing thread through the top of the quilt, that's
Yeah.
always visually distracting. And whether it's dark thread on a light fabric or vice versa, it throws the whole visual off if there's those seams are partly open and you can see the piecing thread. You do want your points to line up and match, and that especially if your design has secondary designs in it.
Mhm.
Um, any errors in piecing will just throw off that whole flow from one area to the next in those secondary designs. So that's where it becomes especially important. Your applique needs to be smooth and tight, sharp points, smooth curves. Now, I will say we're not judging in a sense, we're not judging which technique you used. So
Mhm.
whether you paper pieced it or hand pieced it or traditional machine pieced it, or whether you did fusible applique or raw edge or turn to edge or any of those, what we're judging is how well it suits the piece and how well it's done. But any of those are acceptable. So we're not judging which technique you chose. We're judging the success of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's go back to workmanship and techniques and talk a little bit more about some of the common problems you see. So you've mentioned non-matching threads when you're piecing. Oh, here's a good piecing question. Can you tell us what it means to have your points either floating or cut off and why that could be a problem?
So it depends on where your seam line hits next to the point. So cutoff means you've actually cut into the seam allowance of that one.
Yeah,
Floating points is you sort of go a thread or two to the other direction.
yeah,
In secondary designs, sometimes both can be a problem, but in general, cutoff points are much more noticeable than floating points. So our eye is more forgiving to floating points. And so unless they're really essential to the secondary design, we'll just sort of look past that because we see a nice, crisp, sharp ending there.
yeah,
Um, Now, almost every design principle and a lot of the technical ones can be violated successfully if you do it intentionally. So if you cut off all the points of your triangles really chunky, I'm going to assume you did that on purpose.
yeah.
If you cut off 7 triangle points out of 1,000, I'm going to assume your seam allowance was off a little.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so something really commonly that I see when I'm judging is wobbly borders and sashing. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, the one of the really common judging comments you'll see is long seams and edges of quilt should be straight, and that can start at any point of the construction that can start getting off. And I especially see it in medallion quilts where there's a tendency for them to bulge a little bit in the middles.
Mhm.
And on that first round of the medallion, it's so subtle you couldn't even see it. You'd have to have a ruler to tell. But then you add 4 or 5 or 6 more borders, and then you end up with a parabola because it's not square anymore. But even in other styles of quilts, it's really crucial that those long seams and those sashings line up all the way across, both horizontally and vertically, because it's just again it's one of those things that our eye is really good at picking out, and so it's not very forgiving. It's something that's real noticeable. Most quilt shows that I judge are judged with the quilts on the table, and it's even much more noticeable when they're laying flat and you're sighting down the line of them. It's a little more forgiving when they're hung at
Yeah.
the show, but really really noticeable and can really affect the aesthetic of the final product.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And do you often see problems with differing or uneven quilting densities throughout a quilt?
Yes, I see this both in traditional quilts and in art quilts. There'll be an area of, say, a sunshine or a body of water that'll be very densely quilted,
Yeah.
and then some clouds, and they understandably don't want to quilt those as densely, but it can cause distortion of the quilt top and make things very uneven and difficult to square it up.
Yeah.
And, there are certainly ways to get around that, but for the most part, for the even wear and tear and not having the batting bunch up in your quilt over time, you do want the density of the quilting to be fairly evenly distributed and in scale to the size of the quilt top. So a motif that works on a king size quilt is probably not also going to be suitable for a lap quilt because the scale needs to be changed to be in proportion to not only the space it's filling, but the overall size of the finished quilt.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's move into talking a little bit about thread because we can have tension issues. We can also have stitch length issues. So how does that change the integrity of the quilt?
So the tension issue can absolutely affect how those threads wear, and if the tension is not balanced, those threads will break, and you'll start getting unraveling of your quilting.
Yeah.
The stitch length is more of an aesthetic thing, although it can affect the long-term wear. I've had a few quilters try to tell me that the irregular stitch length was part of their aesthetic,
Oh, yeah.
and if that's true, then I should be able to see, oh, they used longer stitches over here to get this effect and shorter stitches over here to get this effect. And in fact, what I see is just
Mm.
inability to um, control the stitch length. And it's not that it has to be perfect, but it has to be relatively even and consistent. And then also, when especially with machine quilting, you have to have a way to secure the threads when you begin and end a line of quilting, so the starts and stops.
Yeah.
And it used to be the issue I would see as these kind of lumpy things that you thread nests that you could feel with your fingers and see with your eye.
Yeah.
I just saw the last couple of quilt shows I've judged, I've seen quilting that wasn't secured at all. And so it's already unraveling. And so those quilts are going to have a very short lifespan
Yeah.
because here they are in a judging room, fairly relatively new quilts, and the quilting's already coming unraveled because the starts and stops were not secured.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the thing that I hear most when it comes to judging. I hear quilters always say, "Oh, the judge is always so worried about the binding." So let's talk binding.
So if you think of the most beautiful painting that you can think of and you stick a really mismatched, misshapen frame on it, no matter how beautiful the painting is, all you're going to look at is that frame.
Yeah.
And so the binding is the frame of our quilt. And so you can really make or break a design with the edge finish. Now, again, any kind of edge finish is good. The show that I just judged last week, there was a quilt that just the edges were just zigzagged, and there were a couple ladies in the judging room who sort of sniffed at that a little bit, that it wasn't a binding or a facing. And so
Yeah.
I tried to gently point out that it actually suited this design fine,
Yeah.
and it fitted the intended purpose of the quilt, which was to hang on a wall.
Yeah.
So it was not so again, I'm not judging that you picked this technique. I'm judging, does it look right and did you do a good job at it?
Yeah.
Um, so really taking some time, and I will say some judges focus on the edge finish more than others, but I've never seen a judge ever who didn't get pretty excited about a really fancy binding or trim,
Yeah.
because it shows that attention to detail. And by the time you get to that stage, you've done so much to get this quilt ready. And so it's really easy to kind of slack off at that last part. And so going the extra mile to make the edge finish at least neat and tidy. And again, most bed quilts don't need a fancy edge finish. They just need a good, binding or facing to finish up the edge and keep everything in. But if you're quilting specifically for show,
Yeah.
especially at these national shows, then thinking about ways that the edge finish can sort of tie up your whole design can be really useful.
Yeah. So let's just talk for a minute about some of the common problems that you see with binding.
So the most common by far is either that it's not straight or that the width keeps changing as you go along. So it's thick and thin and thick and thin. So it really needs to be, straight and of the same width. It does need to have batting go all the way out to the edge of the binding. And some people feel like that is kind of an arbitrary thing, but it's really not because it does affect the wear of that binding. And yes, the binding is the easiest part to replace, but you don't want to do
Yeah.
that before it's time. So making sure that as you trim your quilt that you leave enough binding to completely fill whatever size batting that I mean, enough batting to fill whatever size binding that you're using.
Yeah.
I do often see people skimp on those stitches on the back, and so they almost look like basting stitches, and they're not going to be secure. A lot of people worry about an all machine binding, but I've seen beautiful ones done that didn't detract from the judging whatsoever. They were very meticulously done and looked beautiful and secure. So again, you can use any technique you want as long as it's going to hold up over time and be consistent.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also when you mention it's almost sometimes like a basting stitch on the back, you almost imagine in your head, like, were they just trying to throw this on at the last minute and get an inch, a stitch every
Right,
inch or
exactly.
something? It's
I
really
I
good to
picture someone on the way to drop off their quilt and finishing it in the car while someone else drives.
have. Yeah, yeah. There's so many times where I've stitched a binding on at the last minute on an airplane on the way to a show or something, but not usually if it's going to be in the show. It's probably part of a class sample or something. But
Sure.
yeah, it's great to have that stitch secure, right? Okay, so that is such great advice about workmanship. So let's just talk in general about what advice would you give a quilter who's entering a quilt show for the first time?
The most important thing is read the instructions, and then read the instructions, and then read the instructions, and then follow them.
Yeah,
And if they're not clear, almost all shows will provide some way to ask questions, an
yeah,
email or something where you can get clarification. Because if you're new, like someone who's entered a lot of shows, it seems really obvious what these entry rules mean. But to a new person, it might not be. So don't hesitate to the I absolutely know that the person on the other end would rather answer your question before they get the form than to
yeah,
have to call you after and clarify.
yeah,
So, but honestly, just filling out the form correctly and putting your quilt in the right category already puts you ahead of the curve. So,
ask
um,
questions about the category. They're there to help you, right? They want you to
yeah,
have
exactly.
success.
Yeah, so if it's in doubt at all, just send a quick email and ask someone, "Hey, I haven't entered a quilt show before. I think this means this. Is that correct? Or what did you mean by this?" So always ask. I think it's important to for people to know also like what we're not judging. So like we're not judging you as a human being.
Mhm.
We're not judging what tools you use to make the quilt with. We're not judging how long it took you to make it. So we're judging a final product. And I know that I have my emotions tied up in those quilts. So just to call it a final product doesn't
Yeah.
doesn't capture how much I have invested in that. But that's what's being judged. You're not being judged. The final product that you made is being judged. And that can be uncomfortable, but it can also be rewarding too.
Yeah, and I can imagine when you're reading the judge's comments afterwards, it could feel so personal when you're reading that because it's something you invested so much time into. But the truth is, it can't possibly be personal because we have no idea as a judge who you are as a quilter. We've never met you and we will never
Yeah.
know who it is. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about advice entering a show. So we've talked about a beginner quilter, or maybe even not a beginner quilter, the first time entry or entrant. But let's talk about someone who's entering a show that maybe requires it to be juried in. So maybe great photography. What would you suggest there?
Yeah, I think the key is to know yourself. I definitely am not as good a photographer as I am a quilter, but I do take my own photos. I do mine. I kind of batch them up, and then when I get a nice, good lighting and no breeze outside, I'll do outside photography just for the good natural lighting.
Yeah.
Other people have elaborate setups. If you know that's just not your skill and this is something important to you, you may need to get someone to photograph them for you just to get the quality of image that you need. It's really important, and this is usually in all the instructions. It's really important that the jury can see all of the quilt and as little else as possible. So they
Yeah.
don't want to see your kids in front of the quilt and they don't want to see the barn the quilt's hanging on, no matter how beautiful and rustic it is.
Yeah.
They want to see all the quilt and as little else as possible that you can get in the photo.
Yeah, in my case, it would be my big garage door because I literally put quilts on my garage door to
That's
photograph them, but
that's
nobody
where
would
I
ever
do
know.
yeah, that's where I
Mhm.
do, and then I just crop them
Yeah.
to the binding.
Okay, now we really want to hit the topic of what do quilt judges look for in an award-winning quilt. So let's get into the process of choosing the top quilts for ribbons. Let's talk about that.
So you're looking at all the things we just talked about. You're looking at the overall visual impact. You're looking at the design and the workmanship, and just you're looking for those little things that sort of show that attention to detail and that care that lifts a quilt up above the rest of the pack. And
Yeah.
some categories it might be first, second, third, and others it might be first, second, third, honorable. They might be that close together. And so when they're that close together, you have to start getting, because I think judging has a reputation for being nitpicky. And I think that's where you see the nitpickiness the most is you have 4 ribbons and you have 6 really high quality entries that are just marginally different from each other. And so then the judge starts thinking about, how many risks did the maker take? Did they include more complex elements? How complex is this design? How many decisions? That's a question I often ask in my head. How many different unique, and of course, I mean, it's a ballpark estimate, but
Yeah.
how many unique decisions did the quilter have to make to get to here?
Yeah.
And so the more complex the technique is, the more difficult and complex the design is, the number of different colors and shapes and things that all have to be unified and brought together. And if that's done successfully, then that quilt is likely to rise to the top of the pack.
Yeah. So just sort of to create an example off the top of my head, you could have three quilts that were pieced exactly the same, but perhaps they vary in the quilting. So maybe one was a big meander all over the quilt, and maybe the second quilt was perhaps a big design that's an all over design of the whole quilt. And then the third quilt might have been color changes in thread in every area of the quilt, and it was all custom quilted, right? So you can see, even though it was the same piecing and perhaps the same color palette, three different degrees of difficulty in the quilting might set one quilt apart, right? Okay.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
the same thing, if I piece a simple 9 patch perfectly and quilt it in diagonal lines perfectly,
Yeah.
but yet another person makes a much more complex design and maybe the workmanship is less than perfect, but
Yeah.
they took so many more risks to get there that that quilt still may place against the one that had the absolutely perfect piecing and quilting because it was this very simple design that didn't take any risks.
Yeah. Oh, this has been such a great conversation. Now, I want to end here today by asking you, what would you like quilters to take most away from our conversation today?
That I think I want them to get that the judging isn't scary, even
Mhm.
though it feels like it can be, especially if it's new to you. The judging often happens in these closed rooms and people are sworn to secrecy, and it seems like that it's this big
Yeah.
mystical thing. And in reality, we're all using these same criteria. And the only reason for the closed room is just to protect those individual people. It's not to protect the judging process. The process itself is completely open
Mhm.
and visible to anyone in the room to see. So all they're protecting really is the confidentiality of each entrant. The
Yeah.
judging process, I love to let people know about it because it's not scary.
Yeah.
And it really a lot of people, in myself included, have been able to advance my work based on comments that I've gotten from other judges, even if it's just knowing what the judging criteria are. When I first started entering quilts, I had no idea what the criteria even were. So just knowing that helps me to improve my own work.
Yeah, that is so great. And also, like, if you're watching this right now and you're thinking, I want to learn more about the judging process, if you have a local show or if there's a show in your area, see if you can volunteer to be in the judging room. You will learn so much just by seeing the process, right?
Yeah, those positions are often coveted to get in, when they're doing the volunteer assignments,
Yeah.
getting a lot of people purposefully try to get in the judging room because they know how much value they'll get out of that.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Now, I have one more thing before we go. Scott Murkin holds a special place in my heart. He's been judging quilt shows for over 20 years, and for the last few years, he's been a mentor to me. So I had the pleasure of meeting him in person recently at QuiltCon, and it was such a joy. He is the kind of person that I can ask the easy questions, the hard questions, and he just tells it like it is. So that is something I love about you, Scott. So it's so great to call you my friend. So thank you for being there for me.
I'm probably blushing now.
No problem. Now, if you loved this interview, please click on that subscribe button and hit the bell so you get notified of every new Quilter on Fire video. And I've interviewed Scott before for a full podcast episode. Why not fill your world with content that you love? So thank you again, Scott. It has been so nice to have you as my guest.
It's been my pleasure.